questions and statements, I'd like to ask our President Ian Bryce to give the thanks to the panel.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Effie. Well, there's some sizzling presentations there. I can see that there's some fireworks about to start at question time, I suspect. But that's what we're here for. In humanism, everything can be questioned, as long as it's done courteously and the questions are soundly based. So we look forward to that. So I'd like to thank our panel, Clive, Vivienne, and also Valerie, for their presentations. We'll thank them in the usual way. Question time.
While we're talking, and if people would like to get information on Israel Palestine, often from Israeli sources, and would like to be on my email list, I'm passing this list around, so you can put your name and details. Say thank you.
All right, can I have... Okay, Faye. Ari. Anyone else question? No. Angela. Okay, anyone else? Danny. John. What's your name? Bill. I'd like to introduce our patron, one of our patrons, Dorothy Buckland Fuller. Welcome. Take a seat, Dorothy. Right, Faye, you're first.
Well, that's just a point of order that it was told we were having 15 minutes per speaker and the second and third speakers went for double that. I'm just wondering whether the first speaker feels she'd need more time.
Do you need more time, Vivian?
No, I'm fine. I can
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you.
Murray?
Okay, there's just so many questions to put down, so I'll be very restrained. I just want to ask the professor, he finished with this point about the Arab citizens of Israel. Yes? The Arab citizens of Israel are present in a one-state solution with both Arabs and Jews. So, following on from that, it struck me that a one-state solution in which all the other Arabs are offered that same citizenship opportunity would seem to follow on from the point you were making there. But it would, of course, contain the risk that one state would have an Arab majority. In that respect, I would expect that there would be opposition to it from a certain part of the Jewish community. I wondered if you could just comment on the idea of a one-state solution where it's just one man, one vote, one person, one vote, and why that would appear on the surface to be the solution to everything. We take that for granted in Australia, but I would just like you to comment on why that, whether that would be desirable, possible, whatever you like to say.
Excuse me, down the back, David, please, can you not talk when there are speakers talking?
Well, the first thing to say about a one-state solution is that it's not a two-state solution. And it is a one-state solution in which the majority would be committed not to notions of democratic inclusion, democratic rights for minorities, but will be adherence to the view that a Jewish minority could at best live under the conditions that the so-called protected minorities lived within classical Islamic society, which meant they could live there and do their business and have their own religious life, provided they didn't create any problem, and provided that they made no demands, and provided that they didn't have a conspicuous place of worship. And look, there is a very noble tradition of attempting to promote that idea on the Jewish Israeli side. The Brit Shalom, the Covenant of Peace movement, which I have certain family connections to Martin Buber, the philosopher, who really gave that option, who tried to promote that view, and it did not prevail. It lacked a certain support on what became the Israeli side, sure. But what sure torpedoed it was that the people who held that view said, if we are going to establish, we're going to remedy Jewish homelessness, create some kind of a Jewish state here in Palestine, we can only do it with moral credibility, with moral legitimacy, on the basis of some negotiation, upon the negotiated consent with the Palestinians. And no Palestinians came forward ever as dialogue, as partnership, as dialogue partners. So it is simply, to go and argue for that, is to argue in effect for the Hamas solution, for a situation in which Jews will at best be allowed to survive, in some form, in a de facto, it is not just a Muslim majority, but an Islamic Islamist state, a Sharia supremacist state, which has built into its fundamental presuppositions that Jews may still exist in the world as a rather awkward historical legacy of the earlier religious history of humankind, but they do not have social, civil and political rights. Now, it's not great fun being an Arab in many ways in Palestine, although in Israel, although many of the disabilities that used to exist about military governance in, say, around Nazareth have been, but there are, they have autonomous life, they are part of national life, they're at universities, they are professionals, there are Arabs in the Israeli diplomatic service. It may, I was negotiating one with somebody mentioned the Bedouin from the south, with a Bedouin Arab who is the president of a major institution of higher learning outside of Beersheba. Now, it may not be everything that people might hope for, one might like for, but it is certainly a lot more than most Palestinians enjoy in terms of their autonomy under Palestinian rule. And it's certainly a lot more than any Jew would expect to have under any state that was run under a Hamas or Hamas dispensation.
Thank you. Vivian would like to add something here.
Yes, I think the question of one state, two states is really a bit theoretical at this point. I can't see a one state or two-state solution emerging. And in any case, I can't see a one-state solution emerging without a two-state state happening, which is what Noam Chomsky would say. And I think the actual realities on the ground are that we do have a de facto one-state solution that may well, in the near future, if there is, the conflict, the prospect of a third intifada is really strong, given everything that's happened to date. And I think that the reality will be an apartheid state across the whole from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, and then it will be a struggle for political, civil rights, on the same as we saw in South Africa, and that will be a secular kind of state. It won't be the kind of Islamic state that Clive is talking about. So I think, we're talking about theoretically here. And may I also remind us that right now the Bedouin, 10,000, are being threatened with removal from their land to enable Jews to go and live there. This is the kind of process that is happening both in the West Bank and in Israel proper. Removal of Palestinians from their homes and replacing them with Jews.
The next question is from Roy, but before I ask him to ask it, please keep your statements or questions short, otherwise not everyone on the list will get a chance. Roy.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. On the question of one state or two state solution, I would say that we do actually have history to tell us what a one state solution is like, because you had far, far more Jews living under the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East than are in the Middle East today. And we know how those Jews were treated. The Ottoman Empire was actually held up as an example of how you can treat Jews kindly. In fact, they had the status of dhimmis. They were treated as very much second-class citizens. They had to pay a tax for living under Islamic rule. This is the best that they could possibly hope for in a rule that's determined by Sharia law under the rule of Hamas, for example. So that would not be acceptable under any circumstances whatsoever to the Israelis. The two-state solution is therefore, in a sense, a more fallback from that. It has to be at least a two-state solution. That was my first one. The other comment I would make is that everything that you said, sir, rang true in my ears. I've spent 10 years listening to debates on Israel and Palestine at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And the shame on the international community is that the problem of Israel and the Palestinians is the only fixed agenda item on the agenda of the Human Rights Council. There's no other situation in the world which appears on that agenda other than that one. Everything else is more general. Freedom of expression, religious freedom, treatment of women, and so on. But the only specific item that's there and it's permanent is occupied Palestinian territories. So I think the international community has a massive responsibility to do away with that. Unfortunately, in the UN, the bad guys are in control.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to say
Well, I agree, and yes, Israel has awareness towards the United Nations, which it does. Yes, we've quoted the United, all these United Nations resolutions produced by this majority. Part of the military history did not include the fact that the Six-Day War started when, because he thought it suited him, Nasser insisted on the removal of the interposed United Nations peacekeeping force in the Sinai. And you can't expect Israel to have a great confidence in the United Nations when, God forbid you should talk about the position of beheaded in Saudi Arabia or whatever, but or about so many other atrocities. This was on the agenda of an organisation that declared that for Zionism, for Jews to have national aspirations, was a form of racism, a kind of judgment that was made for no other. The other thing I'd say about one state, two states, one has to also know the situation of any refugee is awful, but again, the United Nations, the Palestinians are the only religious and whatever group that have their own special dedicated UN organisation to maintain themselves 1 generation, 2, now 3 generations in a state of welfare dependency and political and suspended political animation. Whereas on the other side, yes, they carry that. I am not demanding return of my ancestral properties in Hamburg, in Berlin, in Vienna, in Prague. At a certain stage, some of us have to move on. Not only that,
But
this
you have the right. You have the right, Clive.
I don't exercise it, and, at the same time, this awful place, Israel, has also, its foundation may have been, yes, based on violence. Every state is based upon violence and is maintained by violence. That's why they have armies. Okay, just hang on. But this, hang on a moment. You all had, there were 2 of you and 1 of me. At least let me say what I have to say. The state of Israel then absorbed, just as Palestinians were forced out, a comparable number of Jews were forced to leave Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, and were more or less, not to mention Morocco, Tunis, Algeria, were successfully resettled in Israel. And in any calculation, whether I claim land in whatever, in any overall settlement of the historical accounts post-1948, unless you take that side of the ledger in account, it's all an exercise in bad faith, just talking about the Palestinian refugees. That's what I have to say.
I don't want to talk, I just want to suggest that we, all of us, be confined to 1 minute, whether responding or asking.
You make your rules, I'll make mine. I'm not going to be bound by your... If everybody agrees to it, fine. But I am not going to be silenced here. I come here, it's 2 against 1. Before I can even speak, there's a special dispensation for one of the speakers. So I'm already down at the end of the agenda. Don't try and tell me that what I can't say.
Please,
I'm asking that we have that as a rule and agreement, that we speak 1 minute each and no more.
please leave that to me, and you say if you have anything to add to what I...
No, I don't need to take up the floor.
Right. The next person is Angela.
Yes. I was very interested in this concept of
Angela, can you speak up, please?
Yes, I was very interested in the concept of taqiya, which you mentioned, and I'd like to ask you to repeat that definition and also to tell me if it's Quranic, because that kind of gives me a handle on something that has puzzled and frustrated me. And an example of that was, I think it was you that I heard on 2BL debating Saha Amer. Well, you didn't really debate her because it just wasn't possible. Because, for example, when you brought up jihad, she said, which I've heard before, well, jihad just refers to an inner spiritual struggle. End of possibility of debate. When you brought up the atrocities committed by ISIS currently, she said, well, what about the Crusades, which ended in 1272? So are these sort of things examples of taqiya? And please repeat your definition.
In 1 minute, I shall try. Thank you, sir. Taqiya is the principle that it is permissible and even laudatory to be economical with the truth, to dissimulate in the defence of Islam or the legitimate promotion of Islam. I was at an event last week at some colleague of mine from Columbia University shrugged it off and said, but this is simply, it's not a proper Islamic concept, it's only a concept of those terrible schismatic heretical Shia. But it's, and this is what Sunni Muslim is. But if you look seriously at the history of taqiya, it is not one of Quranic derivation, but it is one that has a strong and powerful lineage and legitimacy within Sunni Islam. Secondly, about jihad. Yes, it is true that Muslims talk about the jihad al-kubra and the jihad al-asghar. There's the little jihad and the big jihad. And the little jihad is just fighting the infidels out there. The big jihad, meaning struggle in the way of Allah, is the struggle within oneself against desire, evil, temptation, etc., etc. That's how it is doctrinally. Yet, in the broad history of Islamic civilization, not from later period, but from the very outset, the primary operative meaning of jihad was struggle in the paradigmatic form of struggle, namely armed struggle, military struggle, on behalf of Islam by Muslims acting militantly and in armed militaries. And that has long been the primary meaning of jihad, and it's only, the genteel liberal intellectuals who've rediscovered the fact, this notion about that's really the minor jihad and the major jihad is struggle with oneself.
Do you want to add anything to that? Danny?
So, very quickly, Roy and I are in an interesting position of having an Israeli Jewish daughter-in-law and a son-in-law married to our daughter here, who is half Palestinian, and whose Palestinian mother was dispossessed of her property in what is now Israel. But anyway, I just wanted to, I feel that you've had a bit too much of the argument on your side. So I just wanted to ask you about a couple of things. One is the continuing settlements. What is your position on that? Do you think it's defensible? And secondly, what about the special privileges accorded to the Judaic religion by Israel? I would like to see Israel as a secular democracy, if really to feel I could support it. And as it is, things like divorce and so on, and who is a Jew are defined religiously, and you get religious privilege for ultra-Orthodox Jews. So I would like to hear what you sort of say on that.
I'm delighted to hear this, and I agree with what I take to be your position, and also Vivian's position. I think that, quote-unquote occupation is unsustainable. It involves moral atrocity and abomination, and it's basically destroying Israel. Which is why Israel, on these people are wondering, how can we try and negotiate our way out from a situation in which the other side knows they've got them by the short and curlies, and they, historically, they know how that that they're rechanneling the resistance against the Crusades. That you conduct a 2-century war of attrition and harassment and make the other side's position untenable, and they will go away. But and these are the rival forms of stubbornness. That is the stubbornness of rechanneling the Crusades on the Palestinians. And the Israeli side says, well, look, if we do nothing, we've got to keep on ratcheting up the price. So we will go keep, while we're thickening the settlements that we want to hold on to, we will go on doing these things. But it's quite clear that in the context of a genuine genuine negotiation, all those things go. And when Syria's towns and whatever they are handed back, I hope the Palestinians will treat them better than all that whole chicken industry in Gaza was treated in Gaza, where they just tore the thing and vandalised and ransacked it in order to go and make building props out. I agree with you also that Israel is not the kind of secular state that many people wish it would be and thinks it should be and owes itself to itself to be. But historically, but as in the context of this awful struggle, Jewish nationalism in Israel has become far more religiously informed and driven, just as Palestinian nationalism has become far more religiously driven. And the tragedy is that clericalist forces are increasing their dominance, their stranglehold on both sides. And the great hope of there being a decent, honourable Palestinian-Israeli settlement would be a modern, liberal, secular, democratic life, and together the sensible people in the middle would dismantle the clericalist mayhem of it. The tragedy has been that there's been a de facto kind of convergence of interests between the clericalist madmen on both sides to make the situation of the liberal secular Democrats on both sides impossible.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Just quickly.
No, Patrick, put your name down.
Just sometimes Israel's said it's a theocracy. Well, that just isn't true. It's more, it's not a theocracy in the sense that Iran is a theocracy where the religious authority rules over the political regime. It's more in the nature of Ireland or Italy, where the religious have preponderant and illegitimate, in my view, power.
I would simply say that theocracy is where God rules, and God rules in neither place. Okay? That's my view.
John?
Okay. Let's see. I do say that, like, Israel has a right to defend itself, and I engage with that. The issue is I put that in a finesse fashion and say Israel does not have the right to defend itself on terms that are defined entirely within its own parameters, without reference to any external sources of authority, any external intellectual sources. So that is a much more finessed view, I think, than the second speaker would have given. I don't know how the UN expresses itself. I would like to think that it is finessed at that level. So, and then I guess the next thing you were saying was that there's this 50-50 casualty rate, but we also heard stories about buildings occupied by civilians doing, aid for amputees and things like that. And I do challenge your assertion that once you press the conflict button, you're automatically going to have this 50-50 ratio of casualties. Certainly, if we take a moral argument that Israel is somehow a lot worse than the way the Allies behaved during World War II, we can't make that argument. We can perhaps say, look, it was deficient in the way it conducted its operations. We can identify faults. We can say things should have been done differently or better. So that's the way I engage that, because I did hear the range of arguments from both yourself and I think it would have been the second speaker. And the other thing we talk about, do we have the right to criticise Israel? In one sense we do not, but the thing is, we live in a country, our country has a government, our government has a foreign policy. That foreign policy is set by various accumulated structures. So even though we may have our own problems with the Aborigines, we can say our government has a foreign policy that is inconsistent with the way we deal with our own Aborigines. Therefore, we can have a view of our government's policy. It's not like Israel is over there doing its own thing in an orbit that's completely separate to anything that goes on in Australian governance. Or in one sense it is. I'm just saying we do have a foreign policy with regard to Israel. So therefore, in that sense, in terms of engaging with our own government and the way it relates to a foreign nation, we can have a view. If Israel was out there doing its own thing and the Australian government had no point of view, then it would be a bit more difficult to justify. But I do think it's justifiable in those terms.
I would say, look, my point is not that... Okay.
We have to, the question of Israel's right to defend itself, of course it has a right to defend itself, as has any country the right to defend itself, as have the Palestinians. Now we have to look at the roots of the latest phase of this conflict, which was when the Hamas and Fatah signed a unity agreement. Israel withdrew from the peace talks because that was supposedly a heinous thing and not in the interest of peace as Israel saw it. And they began attacking Hamas people in the West Bank, and there was a continuing increase in the level of violence. And then the whole thing escalated until we had the 3 teenagers kidnapped, and then there was a huge all-over attack. It wasn't about saving those teenagers, it was about having an all-over attack. And then we got the rockets, and so on. And Hamas itself has said many times that they would, the ending of the rockets is conditional on ending the blockade of Gaza. And it's a blockade that is causing so much immediate misery in Gaza. And this is the way one defends oneself and protects oneself.
Okay, now I have to hurry along. The next one is Bill. I'm extending till 6:15 and then we must stop. Bill?
Yeah, well, I just say that Israel seems to be a special case. For the last 2,000 years, the Jews have been minorities in the countries in which they found themselves, and that's the reason why they've been persecuted. That's their principal problem. And so it was imperative that they established their own state in which they were the majority and in control of their own destiny. And that's, I think, the very powerful reason why the State of Israel was created and why it needs to continue on.
Okay, Paul?
Okay, 2 things. One is that, first, thank you, Clive, because I essentially agree with what you said. One thing that I have issues with is that I think that we Jews fundamentally and primarily are a people, not a religion. According to our traditions, we got the religion from God. Blah, 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 blah. And things follow from that. But primarily and essentially, we are a people. Getting back to what you said about secular religious state. When Israel was created, the people who established Israel simply decided, how do we handle divorce, marriage, all of that kind of stuff. Secular people, they said, oh, it's such a can of bloody worms, let the religious people do it. Terrible mistake. Okay? But according to the but according to the traditions of the Jewish people, it has become the rabbis who decide who is and is not a Jew. That has nothing to do with anybody else. But Israel primarily and essentially is a secular democratic state, theoretically of all of its people, and of course imperfect. But there is one other thing I'd like to ask both of you. Why does Hamas knowingly and deliberately launch rockets when it knows full well that eventually there will be retaliation?
Okay,
I think it's, it's the Zionist argument that, land of our own is the way that Jews could be safe. And this just hasn't proved so historically. And historically, among Jews, there were 2 routes out of the oppression that European Jews, and not all Jews were in Europe, but the majority were, could in fact deal with their oppression. One was through Zionism and a national solution, and the other was through social development and social equality. Yep. And this is represented by the Social Bund, the Jewish Workers' Party. And that is the point I was making in my talk, of this competition between a universalist humanist perspective and an essentialist ethnic solution. And as I said before, I think the universal one is ultimately more powerful, and that we have to link with other forces who have a shared interest in justice and equality and democracy.
Thank you. Victor?
I'd just like to say that I also uphold universalistic humanism in a world that accepts my and my people's humanity and equal status. And that is not what is on offer, and it is not what the Bund got in exchange for their good faith exploration of that.
By the way, I also view the Bundes as a form of Zionism.
That's another particularism.
Okay, Paul, we're running out of time. Victor?
I just stick myself into the camera, because I'm a cameraman. I just want to ask the question of the two speakers, what your view is of Moira's cartoon. He's drawn this cartoon at least twice, one after 9/11, and that was a terrorist thug who had a headlock on an Islamic woman, a Muslim woman. So the message was that the terrorists don't really represent the Muslim community generally. And this question also relates to that when there are these terrorist attacks, I don't know anything about Israel, you get some uneducated people that will harass and trouble particularly Muslim women who wear the hijab or the burqa. So to try and get an understanding of the behaviour of the Muslim community and Hamas. Is Hamas truly representative of what Muslims are like? Or are they, you know, like headlock, the Hamas has got a headlock on the average Muslim?
Well, I'm no friend of Hamas. I mean, well, the kind of world and society that picture is certainly not what I support. What I support is certainly not a universalist humanist view of society. But they came to gain the support of Palestinians in the context where the other party, the Fatah, had been unsuccessful and had descended into corruption. And they were carrying the Palestinian national cause more effectively. I don't know how the elections would run if they were held now. And I do know that there's been opposition to Hamas within Gaza. And this is the whole question of supporting democratic rights. It's like across the whole Arab world. When you had the liberation movement in Egypt, it was overtaken by Islamist forces because the secular ones are much weaker. But that's the course which we find.
Okay,
very briefly, let me say.
Yes.
The point of that cartoon is to say that somehow or other the extremists have, let's not say hiding, but they have grabbed hold of, and they've made the wider Muslim community, the Ummah, and especially the women, their hostages and victims.
Yeah.
And this is true, that Hamas does not represent all of Islam, but the problem is they represent a very literal-minded, scripturalist, clericalist form of Islam. They have grabbed power, and those who have grabbed power that way they were elected under a very dodgy election, but we weren't going to...
No one says that.
But they were... That having happened, people, Hamas or the extremists, and it's happening all throughout the Muslim world, including in Southeast Asia, where I do most of my work, people acting in the name of Islam, in the defense of Islam, and citing the authority of Islamic sacred texts and traditions do this. And the challenge is to the liberal, the humanistic, the democratic, the moderate Muslims to stand up and say, no, you don't speak for us. And a lot of them, for reasons I will understand, aren't brave enough to do it.
Okay, now I have two speakers left. Patrick, you already questioned. Eva, do you want to say something?
I just have a quick question.
Yes.
Maybe
Palestinians said that Hamas started throwing rockets after the 3 young boys were taken, kidnapped, which is not true because they've been throwing rockets 2 or 3 days before that. Continually.
No, only but that ceased around November 11th, and therefore this is the point. And you know how many injuries or anything was resulting from that.
But Israel was dropping leaflets in Gaza to tell people where they were going.
That's a separate issue entirely.
But Hamas would not let the people go. They made them stay there or they'd kill them.
Well, that's what we're told.
Let's just brief that, which gets back to the point there. Israel does not act solely in its own terms. It acts or tries to act under international law, but its problem is that when it acts, it tries to act in a targeted and discriminatory way to target military objectives, although sometimes then it's seen that every bad thing that happens is a result of their targeted, specific efforts. Whereas, somehow or other, the fact that Hamas fires indiscriminately and randomly and recklessly is somehow or other seen as being exculpatory. They're not targeting people, they're just throwing it everywhere, and so they can't be held responsible for the particular people that they hit.
Okay, Patrick, very quickly.
Okay, very short. This is an integration of people in 2 different countries. And it's not the first time. It happened in Fiji. Fiji had a law where it said only Fijians could own the land. The Indians came in and they would not mix with the general public. They had their own schools. They educated them in the Indian ways and their religion, and they owned all the shops. The natives of Fiji were farmers, all right? Now, when they had an election, it was the Indians that got into Parliament, and Fijians thought that they would change the law of ownership of the land. So, I can't remember his name because my memory is short, but he had
By the Marama, they all just moved.
He took control of the country, and the Indians didn't have any more say. They didn't have the say in Parliament that they had, and so the whole lot of integration settled down on its own. But if the Indians had started a war like you've got in the Middle East, this is what would have happened, because they're arguing over land that nobody owns. Then nobody owns only what they think they own, because they're all going to die one way or the other, either by a bomb or they're going to die naturally.
Okay, thank you,
And
Patrick.
the land is still there, it doesn't belong to anybody.
Thanks, Patrick. Now,
That's
you
all
can
this.
come up and you can discuss this further with our speakers. We will need to break up now for supper, which is delicious chicken and onions and tomato and...
We haven't got that problem of integration. We
Just a
accept
minute, I'm
everybody.
speaking. So, we're going to have supper because then at 7 o'clock we're going to listen to Roy Brown from overseas. So please stay around for that. Okay? Thank you. Everybody needs to donate.